Hi everyone, and welcome to today's session on building and construction industry reform. My name's Sharon Levy and I'm a partner in our commercial disputes team. I'll be joined today by Mark Glynn, who is a partner in our property, planning and construction team. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we're broadcasting from today. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today, and also pay my respects to your elders, past, present and emerging. On 11 June 2020, the Design and Building Practitioners Act came into force. It's a real game changer and will impact any person involved in building and construction in New South Wales. The new Act is about restoring public confidence in the New South Wales building industry by regulating the activities of those who design and construct new buildings. Among other things, the Act creates a new duty of care, which is additional to any other duties, statutory warranties, and other obligations imposed by legislation, including the Home Building Act. The duty of care provisions came into force last June when the Act commenced. The start of other provisions of the Act, though, mostly relating to the registration of building practitioners and their reporting requirements, are set to start shortly on 1 July 2021. Also starting on that date are the much awaited Design and Building Practitioners Regulations, which set out the process practitioners now need to follow to ensure their work is compliant with the legislation. As always, the devil is in the detail. So Mark is here to take us through, step by step, the requirements of the legislation. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Sharon, and welcome to everyone who's joining us on this webinar, and thanks very much for your time. As Sharon indicated, the introduction of the design and building practitioners, and in particular the regulations which come into play on the 1st of July, are a game changer and are part of the industry reform that is currently being undertaken in New South Wales. It's difficult to argue based on a number of the examples, those high-profile incidences that we've seen, ranging from the lacrosse fires down there in Melbourne with the combustible cladding to some of the more notable defect issues arising out of the high-rise apartments here in Sydney. That reform is not without justification. The Building Commissioner has been appointed, David Chandler, and he has indicated publicly that one of the biggest issues in construction is the trustworthiness of the completed buildings. In most of the articles and posts that are issued by David Chandler, the term of trust and trustworthiness is used, and it's these reforms that are being brought about, looking, as Sharon indicated earlier, to bring back some trustworthiness into the delivery of the built product. And David Chandler, and particularly the legislation that we're about to talk about today, deals with this issue of trust, particularly in relation to certifications and declarations that are now going to be required throughout the building process. And those certifications will be required, and compliance declarations, before the building work commences, and then again before an application is made for occupation certificates. So it's important to note that occupation certificates are often seen as the gateway where the compliance of the building is transferred across to the purchaser and allows the purchaser to move forward confidently into ownership. So the industry reform that's taking place is a transformation to a more proactive approach. Transformation is moving away from a high-end effort at the back end, at the defects end after owners have occupied their buildings, which is generally regarded as having low impact, to a greater high front-end effort with higher impact. And that transformation is being enabled by two pieces of legislation which impose various regulations both before the work is commenced, that being the Design and Building Practitioners Act, and then again, as I said earlier, before the occupation certificate is issued, and that a lot of that work there is found and enabled by the Residential Apartment Buildings Compliance and Enforcement Powers Act. You can see there that the legislation has brought into play looking at certain compliance requirements of designers and builders, which we'll talk about, and given the Building Commissioner significant powers to enact before work is commenced and also before occupation certificates have been issued. The Design and Building Practitioners Act introduces a regime of compliance declarations, practitioner registrations and insurances. Now, to put this agenda reform into some context, post the lacrosse fire in November 2014, in the year 2017, the Building Ministers Forum commissioned the Shergold Weir report. And the Shergold Weir report has it as terms of reference to examine the compliance and enforcement problems in the building and construction industry affecting the implementation of the National Consumer Construction Code, and to consider strategies for improving compliance and enforcement policies in and around the code. The Shergold Weir report was handed down in February of 2018, and what it found was that accountability of the different parties involved in the construction process was unclear, and that there were insufficient controls on the accuracy of documentation, which made it difficult to ascertain whether or not the building complied with the requirements of the BCA, the Building Code of Australia. Furthermore, the documentation in the current building process lacked a requirement to demonstrate compliance with the code. And what the Shergold Weir report recommended was that there be a national approach to registration and training of practitioners, and also a new statutory duty for design practitioners to prepare documentations to ensure that the buildings are compliant with the code. These are two recommendations out of 24 that the Shergold Weir report handed down, and those are the two that have been picked up and certainly implemented here in New South Wales. In February 2019, the New South Wales Government response to the Shergold Weir report was that it supports the vast majority of the report recommendations, but that it was going to implement four major reforms across the construction industry here in New South Wales. And those four reforms are, as you can see up there on this slide, the appointment of the Building Commissioner, which we've seen now with David Chandler appointed a year and a bit ago, an overhaul of compliance reporting, and the third reform is that building design practitioners with those reporting obligations are to be registered. And the fourth reform was this industry-wide care, statutory duty of care, which Sharon mentioned has been in place since midway through 2020. It's the two reforms 2 and 3 there, the overhaul of the compliance obligations and the registration of practitioners, that we're going to deal with today, because those are the ones that are coming into effect on the 1st of July 2021 in a few days' time, and will be necessary for all those involved in the construction industry to be very aware of. So the Design and Building Practitioners Act, the key reforms that that Act has brought about is the statutory duty of care, as I mentioned, which commenced last year, and then the new limbs of the Act which come into play on the 1st of July this year, being the registration of design and building practitioners and the obligation for compliance declarations to be prepared and issued in respect of certain design elements in the building process. Now, whilst these were included in the Act, it wasn't until we all saw the regulations that we realised exactly what was going to be required in terms of who and what and how practitioners would be required to be registered, and where and when and what would be the form of the compliance declarations that needed to be issued. And those regulations have since been passed, and we're now somewhat clear as to what is required. So moving forward then, if we look at the key provisions of the Design and Building Practitioners Act, and then we'll discuss those and look at some of the new terminology that's introduced by this Act, and look at how that interplays with the regulations. So Section 19 of the Design and Building Practitioners Act states that a builder must not carry out building work for which a regulated design is to be used unless the builder has obtained a design and design compliance declaration from a registered design practitioner. So you'll see there's a number of new terms in there that are new to us and that have been defined and also been given some clarity through the handing down of the regulations. The second provision that we'll look at is section 17, which imposes an obligation on a registered building practitioner to provide a building compliance declaration for building work before the application of an occupation certificate. So you can see, in terms of my earlier point and the transformation towards a more front-end proactive approach, you can see that these key provisions of the design and building practitioner impose obligations for design compliance declarations before work is commenced, and then a subsequent building practitioner's declaration once the work has all but been completed and we're in anticipation of an application for an occupation certificate. But until the regulations came down, we really didn't know what was the detail sitting behind those. And we're now in a position to deal with that. So we've got a range of new terms that we need to look at and to understand. And those terms are arising from those prior sections that I just mentioned: building work, regulated design, a design compliance declaration, a registered design practitioner, a building compliance declaration, which is to be distinguished from a design compliance declaration, and a registered building practitioner. The regulations have now provided us with the detail as to what's involved and what constitutes and defines those new terms. So if we look at, first of all, the section 19, as I said, it starts off with: a builder must not carry out building work. So the obvious question is, what is building work? And for the purposes of this Design and Building Practitioners Act, building work is construction, alteration or additions, repair, renovation or protective treatment of a Class 2 building. A Class 2 building or a mixed-use building containing a Class 2 part. So these regulations and the Act that we're going to talk about today, as we sit here today, are only applicable to Class 2 buildings. And I think that's understandable, given that where we have seen some of the issues that have arisen that I referred to in my very first slide have involved Class 2 buildings. But it is important to note that the second reading speech made it very clear that whilst the legislature intended that the obligations will initially apply only to Class 2 buildings and buildings that contain a part of a Class 2 building, these additional clauses are intended to be included in other classes of buildings in the fullness of time. So as I say there in my slide, the Class 2 application of this Act is for now only. Right, my apologies there for the technical error. Moving on then, section 19 says that a builder must not carry out building work, which we've just identified as at the moment Class 2 or part, a building with a part of Class 2, for which a regulated design is to be used. So the next question obviously is, what is a regulated design? A regulated design means a design prepared for a building element or a design prepared for a performance solution for building work. The Act and the regulations then tell us that a regulated design means a design prepared for a building element. And what constitutes a building element is a fire safety system within the meaning of the Building Code of Australia, waterproofing, internal or external load-bearing component of a building that's essential for the stability of the building, a building enclosure, so a component of a building that is part of a building enclosure, and there's no doubt that that has been included to include facades of buildings, no doubt in response to the combustible cladding issue that was experienced down there in Victoria and on certain other buildings around the country. And then also those aspects of mechanical, plumbing and electrical services for a building that are required to achieve compliance with the code. So a regulated design is a design prepared for those 5 building elements. So what's the form and content of a regulated design involving performance solutions? Section 5 of the Act states that the regulations may prescribe the form and content of a regulated design or a design belonging to a particular class. I don't plan in this session to run through those individually here, but more so just to point out to you that the regulations are very prescriptive. And so if you're looking to understand what is the form and content of a design, or as we'll see later, the form and content of a declaration, or the requirements that must be met to become a registered practitioner, the answer invariably will lie, at least at first instance, in the regulation. So a regulated design is governed by Regulation 5, and it's a design prepared for performance solution, and it must include relevant plans that show or specifications that describe the physical elements. And if there's no plans included, then a description of those physical elements, a description and justification of the performance solution, and the acceptance criteria and parameters on which the justification is based. Moving ahead to the next slide, regulation design prepared for performance must also include a statement of the performance solution that complies with the relevant components of the code, and a copy of the brief on which the justification is based. So as I say, the intention of today's seminar is not to actually go through the individual content of this regulated design, but rather just to allow practitioners to be aware that if they're looking to find out what needs to be included in a regulated design or any of the direct declarations, then the best place to start is to head into the regulations, because they are prescriptive. I do note there that Regulation 6 says that for regulated designs for fire-resisting building elements, there are some additional inclusions that need to be included in a design. And similarly, Regulation 7 provides some further inclusions required for a regulated design relating to the integration of vertical transportation and justice. All right. So what is a design declaration? So we've said, again, repeating section 19, the builder mustn't carry out building work for which a design is to be used unless the practitioner has obtained a design and a design compliance declaration. The design compliance declaration is a declaration as to whether or not a regulated design complies with the Building Code of Australia, and whether or not the design integrates other aspects. So you can see back to one of the findings of the Shergold Weir report, where they found that accountability was unclear and there was insufficient requirement for documentation to attest to compliance with the Building Code of Australia. You can see that the design compliance declarations that are provided for, and which must be provided and as we'll see later, lodged, deal and address that issue front on. So the declaration has to declare whether or not a regulation design complies with the BCA and whether it integrates other aspects of other building work. Continuing on, the declaration must declare as to whether or not a building product referred to in the design would, if used in a way consistent with the design, achieve compliance with the Building Code of Australia. And then there's some other elements there that the design compliance declaration which must be met. Again, if you're looking to see what must be included in the design compliance declaration, the regulations certainly have set that out for us. I mentioned earlier that there are some additional points that need to be included in a regulated design for fire-resisting elements and for vertical transportation. Just by way of interest, for the additional inclusions in a declaration for vertical transportation registered design are set out here, whether or not the design integrates the product in accordance with the authorisation under the WH&S Act, and whether or not the design appropriately integrates, whether or not the practitioner has advised the designer within the meaning of the Work Health and Safety Act. So again, if you're preparing a regulated design and to provide a compliance declaration in relation to a vertical transportation design, there are some additional elements that need to be included in your design compliance declaration. So what is the form of the design compliance declaration? The regulations specifically state that the design compliance declaration must be in one of the following forms. A form approved by the Secretary and published on the website of the Department of Customer Service, or a form specified on the New South Wales Planning Portal. Now, in preparing for this seminar, I did look on those on the website. I don't have access to the Planning Portal, and there were no forms. I looked on those last week and the forms were not up there. But in terms of practitioners that are going to be providing design compliance declarations, not only do the regs prescribe the content of those declarations, but also provide the form of those declarations. So practitioners will need to get accustomed to looking at the Fair Work website and having a look at the various forms that are up there, because the declarations must comply with the form provided on the website or within the New South Wales Planning Portal. So when must a design declaration be provided by a registered design practitioner? So before the commencement of the work, and again, this is in compliance and consistent with my earlier point of the proactive front-end approach to this regulation. So the design practitioner must provide the design compliance declaration before commencement of the work when the regulated design is provided in a form suitable in connection with the building work. So the design has to be of a form that's ready for construction, in a form that's suitable for use in connection with the building work. Now, just to ensure that the design practitioner provides that design compliance within that time frame, i.e. before commencement of the building work, it's worth noting Regulation 29 that provides that a construction certificate or complying development certificate is prohibited from being issued unless the regulated design and design compliance certificate have been provided to the person issuing the certificate. So the clear message there is, absent a design and design compliance declaration completed by a registered design practitioner, there can be no construction certificate issued by the certifier. Additionally, when must the design compliance declaration be provided? After commencement of work, where there's a variation of the work, where a regulated design is varied, it has to be provided in a form suitable for use in connection with the work. So where there's a variation of a regulated design, there needs to be a new design compliance declaration provided at the same time as the design is provided in a form that's suitable for connection in relation to the building work. So when must the compliance declaration be lodged? So there are requirements not only for design practitioners to provide the design declarations, design compliance declarations, but also there's an obligation on the builder to lodge the construction issued regulated design and the design compliance declaration on the New South Wales Planning Portal before commencing building work. So it's very clear here, it's before commencing building work. It's not before commencing the building work to which the regulated design relates. It means the commencement of all building work. So all regulated designs need to be provided and lodged on the New South Wales Planning Portal before any building work is commenced. Now, the practitioner's got to lodge construction issued regulated design. So what is that? The regs again provide us with a definition of that, which you can look at, but in short, the design compliance declaration must provide that it contains the necessary detail to produce building work that would achieve compliance with the code, including details specifying the proposed dimensions of the completed building, the characteristics and materials comprising the proposed building, and the location of the building elements and systems proposed in the building. They've got to be in a form that it can be used by the building practitioner to carry out the work in accordance with the regulated design. So they're the detailed for construction designs. When must that be lodged? In the case of a design compliance declaration after the work has commenced, they've got to be lodged on the New South Wales portal 1 day after commencing the variation work. And that is an obligation that is imposed on the building commissioner to lodge the design compliance declaration for the varied regulated design, as well as the varied regulated design. Whilst these obligations to lodge them on the New South Wales Planning Portal do lie with the builder, there is a provision that provides the builder to give written authorisation for these documents to be lodged on his or her behalf by the registered design practitioner. So again, when one's looking at one's contracts with design consultants, it might be worth considering passing through that obligation and that authorisation that the design consultants lodge their regulated design and design compliance declarations on behalf of the builder directly onto the New South Wales Planning Portal. So who is a registered design practitioner? Well, a person who intends to prepare regulated designs and intends to make design compliance declarations must register as a design practitioner. And the regulations provide us with 18 classes of registration as design professionals. And interesting to note that professional engineers who are required to be registered separately under this Act, which we'll discuss later if they're providing engineering work, professional engineering work, but who intend to make design compliance declarations must register as design practitioners. There is a class of registration for a design practitioner body corporate, but the body corporate must have an employee who is registered. Some of these registrations already require registration under other legislation, for example, residential builders and architects and engineers, but for the purposes of preparing regulated designs and providing design compliance declarations, they must also now be registered under the Design and Building Practitioners Act. You can be registered across more than one class if you qualify, which will then allow you to make a compliance declaration for more than one regulated design. So let's have a look at an example for a registered design practitioner who holds a design practitioner facade class of registration. As I said, there are 18 classes of registration. I just wanted to step you through one of the classes, being the design practitioner facades, to let you know what is provided for in the regulations in terms of registration and what they're authorised to do. So a design practitioner facade who holds this class of registration is authorised by the regulations to prepare or vary a regulated design in relation to the facade of a building, and also authorised to make a design compliance declaration for that facade regulated design. So who is qualified to become a design practitioner, facade design engineer, design practitioner in the facade space? So again, the regulations, as I've said on a number of occasions, are very prescriptive, and at Schedule 2, they provide a list of the qualifications that must be met to achieve registration in this class. I won't run through them, but again, it was just for the purposes of showing the audience today that the regulations do in fact provide the various pathways to registration. So in the case of a design practitioner facade, to hold that class of registration, you must be at least one of the following. Your qualifications must include an accredited 4-year full-time or equivalent undergraduate degree, or a postgraduate master's degree in engineering, civil engineering, mechanical engineering, or structural engineering. There's a pathway for a non-accredited qualification that has been assessed as being equivalent to an accredited qualification in the undergraduate and master's area. And there's some specifications or some criteria here for the non-accredited qualification. Or to be registered as a design practitioner facade, you can be a professional registration as an engineer in civil, mechanical, or structural disciplines. But the important thing, as I repeat again, is that if you're looking for the criteria for the qualifications to achieve a certain class of registration, the regulations provide that. Similarly, they provide the knowledge criteria that must be met. So the applicant must know and understand the Design and Building Practitioners Act and the regulations, the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, as well as the Building Codes of Australia and general building design methods and materials and planning to the extent that it's relevant to the class for which they're applying. They must have certain skills as well that must be met. So to apply for registration in the class of designer practitioner for facades, which will authorise you to prepare regulated designs and to provide compliance declarations for the facade of a building, you must be registered in this class. I mentioned earlier that the Act and the regulations deal separately with engineers. Part 3 deals with engineers, and what Section 32 of the Act says is that a person must not carry out professional engineering work in a prescribed area of engineering unless the person is a registered professional engineer and the person's registration authorises the person to carry out professional engineering work. So this is in addition to and separate to requirements to be a design practitioner if you are an engineer and you intend to design regulated designs and you intend to provide a design compliance declaration in respect of that regulated design. So there are a couple of new terms here which we need to look at. There's professional engineering work. What are the prescribed areas of engineering that this section applies to? Who and how do you become a registered professional engineer? And having achieved that registration, what is the authorisation that that registration provides you? So a person must not carry out professional engineering work is what Section 7 is how Section 32 commences. What is professional engineering work? Professional engineering work means engineering work that requires an application of engineering principles and data to a design and a construction procedure, operation or maintenance activity related to engineering. So it's fairly general in terms of what is covered by the term professional engineering work. But remember what I said earlier, this Act as it currently stands only applies to Class 2 buildings or a building that is in part Class 2. So the regulations, that Regulation 14 states that engineering work that is not directly in relation to Class 2 is not professional engineering work for the purposes of this Act. What is a prescribed area of engineering? So again, if we go back to Section 32, a person mustn't carry out professional engineering work in a prescribed area of engineering. And prescribed area of engineering means the following: structural engineering, civil engineering, mechanical engineering, fire safety engineering and electrical engineering, they were included in the Act. And then the geotechnical engineering was prescribed by the regulation. So these are the 6 areas of prescribed area of engineering that are bound and caught up by the registration requirements for engineers under the Design and Building Practitioners Act. So who must be a registered professional engineer? The person who carries out professional engineering in those prescribed areas that we looked at just on the prior slide in relation to design and construction of a Class 2 building must be a registered professional engineering in one of the following 6 classes of registration. So you need to be a professional engineer in the area of civil, electrical, fire safety, geotechnical, mechanical, or a professional structural engineer. So again, if I could just take you to one of those classes of registration by way of example, a registered professional engineer who holds a professional engineer fire safety class of registration is authorised to carry out professional engineering work in the area of fire safety engineering. And that's covered by Schedule 1, Regulation 31 of the regs. What are the qualifications for registration as a professional engineer in the fire safety class of registration? Again, I don't want to go through this in detail. Suffice it to say that the regulations provide that there are 5 pathways to achieve the qualifications required for registration in this class. And by way of example, pathway number 1 requires at least one of the 4-year full-time or equivalent undergraduate bachelor degree in fire safety engineering or engineering with a major in fire safety, or an accredited postgraduate master's degree in fire safety engineering, or a non-accredited equivalent. So again, if you are looking to operate in that space as a professional engineer, you need to go into the regulations and have a look at the qualifications that are required and have a look and make sure you meet those criteria. The next area that I want to talk about now are building compliance declarations. Now, these are not to be compared or confused with design compliance declarations. Just to recap, a design compliance declaration is a declaration in relation to a regulated design that must be prepared and provided and lodged before commencement of the work. What the Act also provides now is for registered building practitioners to provide a building compliance declaration for the building work. And this declaration is to be provided before application for an occupation certificate. So what does this compliance declaration involve? This is a declaration as to whether or not the building work has been completed and carried out and complies with the Building Code of Australia. So again, this addresses based on some of the issues that were identified in the Shergold Weir report of having documentation that attests to the compliance of building work with the code. Again, if you're looking at what is required in a building compliance declaration, the devil is in the detail, and the detail is now set out in the Act and the regs. So there's a declaration by the building practitioner, so there can be no confusion and can't be unclear as to accountability, which is one of the findings of that Shergold Weir report. That a registered building practitioner must provide this declaration. As I say, it's a declaration as to whether or not the building work complies with the Act, whether it integrates details of other aspects of the work and other regulated designs. Interesting, if you look at point number 3 there, the registered building practitioner has to declare whether the building work was built in accordance, whether the regulated designs were used for the building work and whether they were prepared by a registered design practitioner. So again, the obligation on the builder to ensure that his regulated designs are prepared by registered design practitioners. And then whether the building work was built in accordance with that regulated design. Again, there'll be very little confusion as to where accountability lies, both in terms of the preparation of the regulated design by a registered design practitioner, as attested to by the design compliance declarations, and then whether or not the work has been carried out and completed in accordance with those regulated designs and whether or not it complies with the Building Code of Australia. And this will be found in the building compliance declarations, which are to be prepared by the registered building practitioner prior to application for the occupation certificate. What is the form of the building compliance declaration? Again, the form is to be in that form which is specified on the New South Wales Planning Portal. So registered building practitioners who intend to make a building compliance declaration need to get on and register on the portal and have a look and see what is the form of the compliance declaration that is required to be lodged. When must the declarations be provided? As I say, it must be provided before an application for the occupation certificate is made, and it must be provided to the person for whom the building work is done. Interestingly, similarly in the case of design practitioners and the requirement that a certifier cannot issue a construction certificate without being provided with copies of the design compliance declarations, Regulation 30 provides that an occupation certificate is prohibited from being issued unless a building compliance declaration has been provided to the person issuing the certificate. Again, the message is very clear. These compliance declarations must be obtained, must be lodged, and must be provided to the relevant certifying authority at the time of issuing both construction certificates and occupation certificates. There are other documents that the Act and the regs prescribe must be provided at the same time by a building practitioner before the application of the occupation certificate, and these other documents include contracted documents. So together with the building compliance declaration, there must be provided the contracted documents, the documents in which the building practitioner lists the subcontractors and consultants engaged by builders to do the work, and lists the work done by subcontractors and consultants, together with the final designs for building work which are not regulated designs. Equally, there is what they refer to as referred documents, which are set out in the regs at Regulation 18.2, which provides a copy of each variation statement that is required to the building work, and a copy of each regulated design that contains additional details not reflected in the construction issued regulated design. So there is further documentation that has to be provided by the building practitioner before application for the occupation certificate. And those documentations must be provided in an approved way and lodged in an approved way on the New South Wales Planning Portal. So you can see there's going to be a repository on the New South Wales Planning Portal where people can easily access, or where it is likely to be found, all the various regulated designs and all the various compliance declarations of both design practitioners and building practitioners in relation to a building, all found in the one spot, which is not currently the situation. They can be often found in a multiple of spots at the moment. So lodgement before the application for the occupation certificate on the planning portal, the practitioner must lodge the building compliance declaration, those contracted documents, and those required documents that we just looked at on the previous slide. They're going to be uploaded up onto the New South Wales Planning Portal by the building practitioner. So who is a registered building practitioner? So a person who intends to make a building compliance declaration must be a registered practitioner under the Act. And as we saw in the case of design practitioners, there are a range of classes of registered building practitioners, and there are three classes. There's a building practitioner body corporate class of registration. There is a building practitioner body corporate nominee class, and there's a building practitioner general class of registration. So a building practitioner body corporate class of registration is a registration for a body corporate that is authorised to make a building compliance declaration for building work. But that compliance declaration can only be made by way of a nominated individual. And a nominated individual means an individual who is nominated by the body corporate by giving written notice to the secretary, and an individual who holds a building practitioner body corporate nominee or building practitioner general class of registration. A body corporate can issue a compliance declaration, but that compliance declaration must be given on behalf of that body corporate by a nominated individual who holds either a nominee registration or a general class of registration. So again, if you're looking to understand what are the qualifications of registration, again, the Act and the regulations in particular provide that. The qualifications for a body corporate, for building practitioner body corporate class of registration, obviously must be a body corporate, must hold a contractor license authorising the holder to do general building work under the Home Building Act, and must nominate an individual who's registered as a building practitioner nominee, or who holds a building practitioner general class of registration to provide the compliance declaration on behalf of the body corporate. And a building practitioner body corporate nominee is able to provide a declaration on behalf of the registered body corporate and make a building compliance declaration for building work, and prepare and provide documents that are required to be prepared and provided by a building practitioner under the Act and under the regulation. Qualifications, again, they're found in the regs for a building practitioner body corporate nominee are set out there. The holder must hold a supervisor certificate authorising that holder to do general building work under the Home Building Act, and must have experience of at least 5 years recent relevant practical experience, together with some criteria in regards to knowledge and general skills that must be met to achieve that class of registration. Similarly, a building practitioner in the general class of registration is authorised to make a building compliance declaration for building work and to provide and prepare documentation. So this registration of building practitioners, design and building practitioners, as I mentioned at the outset, comes into being on the 1st of July. So from the 1st of July, design and building practitioners must be registered if they intend to make compliance declarations, and engineers must be registered if they intend to perform professional engineering as defined in the Act. Now, it's up to the designers and the builders to apply for registration. The Secretary has the power to refuse to grant a registration, and what the Act provides is that the Secretary is taken to have refused a registration if the Secretary fails to give notice of a decision within 28 days. So the salient message there is from 1 July, if you're intending to provide compliance declarations or perform professional engineering work, you must be registered. It's up to you to make the application for registration, and those registrations can be refused. And if you haven't had that notice within 28 days, then your application is taken to have been refused by the Secretary. Once you are registered, there is continuing professional development obligations. So registered design practitioners and registered building practitioners must complete 3 hours CPD each year. They're obliged under the Act to keep records of those CPD hours for 5 years, and when requested by the Secretary, must provide details of those records as evidence of completion and compliance with that CPD requirement. Similarly, the regulations provide that registered design practitioners and registered building practitioners must comply with a code of practice. So again, I'd encourage all those that intend to operate and achieve registration in this area to have a look at the code of practice. It provides that these design and building practitioners must act in a professional manner, must act within a level of competence and experience that they hold, must maintain satisfactory levels of competence. There's a duty to maintain confidentiality and a duty to avoid conflicts of interest. Similarly, for those that intend to register as professional engineers, there's an obligation on those registered to comply with a code of practice that's been set out in the regulations at Schedule 4 for professional engineers. And those codes of practice deal with subject matter such as acting professionally, maintaining a satisfactory level of competence, acting in the best interests of the client, avoiding conflicts of interest, and duties not to misinform or mislead. So you need to be aware that part of your obligations as under your registration will be to comply with these various codes of practice depending on your class of registration. So obviously with all these requirements coming into play on the 1st of July this year, there are obviously some transitional requirements or some transitional regulations to allow that to happen. The transitional registration provisions provide as follows. There's a deemed registration for practitioners who apply for registration in the period of 1st of July to the 31st of December. Now, bear in mind that deemed registration only takes effect after the practitioner applies for registration. So until you actually put your application in for registration, you don't get the benefit of that deemed registration. Now, the only proviso there is that practitioners can perform regulated design work and make declaration whilst unregistered in the first 7 days of July. So the only time within which you can provide these designs without having got your registration in and taking advantage of the deeming provisions for the period 1 July to 7 July 2021. So that does not leave a lot of time. Equally, to qualify for the deemed registration, the practitioners have to form a reasonable view that they are an eligible person to be registered in a particular class. So when you look at your application, you need to dive into the regulations and have a look at the qualifications, the skills and the experience, and satisfy yourself on a reasonable view that you're an eligible person for registration within that class. Again, the important message again here is the timing. You get the benefit of the deemed registration, but only once you put your registration application in. Like all things, there will be fees, and as I was able to find some details on the proposed registration fees. So for a design practitioner, the application fee for a level 1 design practitioner, and a level 1 design practitioner is where registration is dependent on registration under another recognised scheme. The application will be $405 for 1 year or $1,519 for 5 years. There are also some renewal costs and fees that I've set out there. If you're a design practitioner for level 2 design practitioners will be certain classes where there's more validation of qualifications required in the areas such as drainage and facade and fire systems to make an assessment as to whether or not a design practitioner meets the relevant requirements. Similarly, for professional engineers, the application for 1 year registration is $592, all the way up to $2,219 for an application for a 5-year registration. These I did just check prior to coming to this seminar today. Those registration fees are now listed up on the New South Wales Fair Trading website. So if you want to know more about what those fees are, and additional here, the fees for building practitioners, you can go into their website there, Fair Trading, and have a look at what those fees are. So the obvious question that always arises is what happens with existing projects? So where work commences before 1 July 2021, if the regulated building work is authorised to be carried out by a construction certificate or a complying development certificate, and some of the work commences before 1 July 2021, then design practitioners are not required to give a design compliance declaration in respect of designs. No one's required to be registered under the Act before carrying out the regulated building work, and there's no need for building compliance declarations to be prepared for regulated building work. So for projects that are underway and construction certificates issued, these new requirements are not applicable. That brings me to the end of the presentation. I appreciate that there's a lot of detail there. I suppose my objective was simply to allow the audience to understand the types of detail that is provided for in the regulation, whilst not necessarily committing it all to memory here, but that the regulations are very prescriptive. As they say, they do get down to the form and content of various declarations. They provide great detail as to the qualifications and criteria and skills and experience that are required to become registration. And all this will kick off on the 1st of July 2021. And bear in mind that there is these deeming provisions for registration. So I encourage you all, that those that particularly intend to operate in this space and provide compliance declarations and to prepare regulated designs, to get their applications in and take advantage of those deeming provisions. Because until your application goes in, you are not deemed to be registered. That brings me to the end. I thank you very much for your time. I wish you well with this new regulation. No doubt there will be some teething problems. If any of you have any questions or queries, or like just to have a discussion generally about certain aspects of the regulation, feel free to contact either Sharon or myself, whose details are up on your screen now. Thank you very much for your time. Cheerio.